My brothers and sisters, the Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus addressed this parable to those who were convinced of their own righteousness and despised everyone else. Two people went up to the temple area to pray. One was a Pharisee, and the other was a tax collector. The Pharisee took up his position and spoke this prayer to himself. "O God, I thank you that I am not like the rest of humanity, greedy, dishonest, adulterous, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I pay tithes on my whole income." But the tax collector stood off at a distance and would not even raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast and prayed, "O God, be merciful to me, a sinner." I tell you, the latter went home justified, not the former. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Well, it was some time ago, I was talking with a seminarian who was pretty close to his ordination. And he had shared that he was having dreams, almost nightmares, if you will, in time of preparation for his ordination. So maybe those of you who are married, some of you had nightmares before you got married. I don't know. We won't ask that question, huh? Maybe you have nightmares after you're married. We won't ask that question either. He kept having this recurring dream, and the dream, as I remember it, was this. He dreamt that he got to the cathedral for his ordination, and they forgot that he was being ordained. And he said it was a very vivid dream. As he described it, he said, everything was all set, and the bishop's master of ceremonies was running around getting everything put together, but they forgot that he was being ordained. And he said, I remember in the dream going up to the master of ceremonies and saying, how could you forget I'm getting ordained? He said, well, there's an awful lot of details, and we've just got so much to do, it simply slipped our mind that you're getting ordained. He said, but you need someone at the ordination to be ordained. How could you forget that I was getting ordained? And he was rather dramatic in this, and he said finally, they didn't even have a place for him to sit in the dream. He had to be in the back row at his own ordination. Then he talked about the dreams he was having about his first Mass. And he was having nightmares about the first Mass, and he said he dreamt that he got to the church for his Mass, and again, everything was all set, but his master of ceremonies had no vestments for him to wear at all. There wasn't one thing to wear anywhere in the church. So as he said in the dream, he was celebrating his first Mass in a suit coat and tie. I told him we need to take a step back and think what's going on, and think what exactly are you bringing to the altar. I think there was a message in those dreams, and how often all of us can get so busied, about so many things, and we almost come in a fury to the altar, and we fail to bring ourselves along with us. Simple question, what is it that you bring to the altar? What do you bring to the altar? Today, as you come to Mass, anytime you come to Mass, what do you bring, if you will, to the altar every day when you pray? And what is it that you bring to the other small a altars of your life, the altar of your office, the altar of your school, the altar of your neighborhood and various activities, what is it that you bring to the altar? I remember my own experience of my own ordination. I wasn't having nightmares, but I remember the morning of my ordination, I woke up about 6 o'clock in the morning because it was thundering and lightning. And the rain that was falling makes what we endured the last 2 days look like one drop. It was raining sideways. It was a horrible morning. I remember it vividly. And I remember buzzing Monsignor Pa. I was assigned a nativity here on Harris Hill in Maine. I buzzed Monsignor Pa, and I said, Monsignor, it's raining, and I'm getting ordained today. And he said, well, that could be a problem. He said, answer this, does the church have a roof? And I said, it does. He said, I don't think there's anything to worry about. So, not getting the proper compassion I felt I was due, I called my mother. And I told my mother that it was raining, and I was getting ordained that day. And my mother, in her compassion, said, I don't think it's going to stop your ordination. And then I went to church. I remember this vividly. I went to church to pray morning prayer and open the breviary. In the second psalm, almost near the top, the words of the psalm were this: may my instruction soak into you like the rain. Said even God has got a sense of humor today. And, I had to let it go. I had to let it go. How often do we not let things go? We're kind of in a fury or anger, frustrated, many other things. And we bring that to the altar. What is it that we really bring to the altar? I remember talking to a priest not that long ago who went to Africa. I someday hope to go there myself. He said, Mass there is 3 hours long. I think I'd fit in pretty good, don't you think? 3 hours, that's a piece of cake. And and he said, he remembers when it came time for the offertory. He said, the seminary did not prepare him for what he was going to experience, and it's true. And many of you know Father Joe very well. You can tell him I'm saying publicly, the seminary does not prepare us for everything that we will experience. And this young priest said, they brought the wine, and he was used to that, and gave it to the server. And another person brought the host, the bread, and gave that to the server. And so next person in line brought a blanket. So, well, what am I supposed to do with this? The woman had made it, so he placed it up on the altar. And said another person came bringing a basket of produce. And he said, well, what am I supposed to do with this? He put it up by the altar. He said, then it got interesting. He said, this one person, was a long line. He said, one person brought a goat. He said, what am I supposed to do with a goat? So the seminary did not teach us what we were supposed to do with a goat. And so, he pounded off on someone. And he said, the last person in line presented him with a baby. He said, no, I like babies. He said, I'm not really sure I could take care of a baby, but they presented him a baby. What does that tell us about Mass in Africa? It tells us that the people present all of who they are to the altar. The fruit of their labor, their very lives. They bring the best of what they have to lay that at the altar of God. What is it that you bring to the altar? And if we look at the gospel today, what is it that is brought to the altar? Maybe not so much the altar, but certainly the temple in prayer. We see the Pharisees. The Pharisees, I think he brought 2 broken arms to the altar because he was busy patting himself on the back. I am so glad I'm me. Everybody else should be like me, and the world should honor me, huh? It's all we hear from the words of the Pharisee. I'm doing everything right. I am really one of the greatest things walking the face of the earth. What did that Pharisee bring to the altar? Self-righteousness. not necessarily a good thing to bring to the altar. And then we see the tax collector, and I always take those things personal since my father worked for the IRS. And, you know, what is it that we see the tax collector bring to the altar? He brought humility, standing afar off. He brought remorse. He brought a need for forgiveness. That's what he brought to the altar. You know, what is it that you bring to the altar? What is it you bring day in and day out to the altar of your prayer in every facet of your life? I remember shortly after I was ordained visiting a nursing home, and the person I went to visit was a very nice little old lady. Life had not been too kind to her, I suppose. She had been ill a good portion of her life, in and out. She had kind of modest jobs and a modest income and life, and never really married or had children, and you know, life was a little tough for her, but a wonderful person. And as we sat and visited, her rosary was in her hand, and it had, you know, divot marks from being pounded so much over the years. It's the kind of rosary you want to have, well battle-worn, used one. And her prayer book, which was with her, you know, was disintegrating. And she talked about her prayer and all the lists of people she prays for. Kind of prayer book you want to have, not a new one, a good, well-used one. As we were sitting in the common room visiting, I remember a gentleman who also was a resident of the nursing home came in, and as the oddities of life have it, the two of them knew each other as they went to school together. And this gentleman sat, and it was interesting listening to the two of them talk, and he had a very different life. A life for him, he owned several businesses and several homes in different places in our country and outside the country. And he was going on and on, talking about his travels and all the beautiful things he had accomplished in life, which are wonderful accomplishments, of course. And when he was done, this nice little old lady summed up the entire meaning of life in one sentence. She said to her classmates, she said, to think after you have done all of that, you're going to die here with me. And said, you summed it up right. What is it that we bring to the altar, and what is the ultimate goal of our lives? What did St. Paul bring to the altar, and what was the goal of his life? And in the second reading, we hear he brought his very self to the altar. He said, I'm pouring myself out like a libation, spending his whole life to preach and teach the gospel. That's what he brought to the altar. And he said, my time of departure is near, meaning the time of my ministry is coming to a close. He said, I've run the race. And what was the goal for Paul in that reading? He said, a meritorious crown of righteousness awaits me. It's a beautiful goal, talking about sharing in that royal nature we have in the kingdom of heaven. Now, how many of you remember Crystal Beach? And I mean the real Crystal Beach, the rides, not the new condos that are there, the real Crystal Beach, huh? You know, and, you know, when I was growing up, the third floor of our house was all finished off. My father finished it off. It was the early form of a man cave, I suppose. It's where my dad had all of his books and all kinds of things. And one of the things that hung on the wall in the attic was a serving tray from Crystal Beach. And it was a commemorative tray from the coronation of Queen Elizabeth. And as a little boy, my mother, you know, she had a striking resemblance, actually, to Queen Elizabeth. And I always thought that was my mother on the tray. And I could never figure out if we could afford all of the diamonds for the tiara and the earrings and the necklace, why we were still in Black Rock. I couldn't figure that out ever. But as I got a little older, I realized it wasn't my mother, it was Queen Elizabeth, Well, I share that image with you as this very reading we had was the second reading at my mother's funeral, and I used that tray at my mother's funeral saying she finally got her crown because she was always focused on the kingdom of heaven and that crown that awaits us all. What is the real goal? The real goal is that crown that awaits us, and what we bring to the altar helps get us there. So we just think today, what is it that we bring to the altar as we come every Sunday for Mass? What do you bring to the altar of your personal prayer? What is it that you bring to the altar at your desk at school or the locker room before a game? What is it that you take to the altar wherever that altar of your employment may be? If it be a desk, an operating room, a factory. What is it that you're going to take to the altar of the voting booth in a couple short weeks? We have major decisions to make. Are we going to take the altar of humility and the values of the gospel and vote based on those standards? Or are we going to take something else to the altar that day of the voting booth? We do need to question, what is it that we take to the altar, physical here, the altar of our labor in the name of Christ, the altar of our prayer? Is it humility rooted in the teaching of God, or self-righteousness rooted in our own thought, success, and opinion?